Welcome to Healthcare Rounds, your insider access to the healthcare industry. I'm your host, John Marchica, CEO of Darwin Research Group. I'm really excited. Today, our guest is Dr. Robert Hariri, who's CEO of Celularity, Inc. And we're going to be diving into the fascinating world of cell therapies, which I know a lot of you are probably wondering about. You read a lot about them. So just amazing new treatments are available. Well, we've got an expert today. But without me stepping too much on you, Dr. Hariri, I'm gonna leave it to you and say, good way to start as always. Walk us through your background and what got you to Celularity today.
Well, John, first of all, thanks a million for having me. It's a treat, and I'm excited to be speaking with you. So my background is somewhat diverse. I'm an engineer by undergraduate and kind of my first career. And I then went and did my MD and PhD, and I'm a neurosurgeon by profession and a scientist by avocation. And for the last 30 years, I've been working in the world of biotechnology, developing novel ways to treat some pretty challenging medical and clinical conditions. And the way I got to Celularity is simply enough. I started a company about 25 years ago that was focused on this emerging field of cellular medicine. At the dawn of the science around stem cells, guys like me thought, well, wow, this might be a tool we could use to treat some of the really terrible diseases and injuries that we face. And as a neurosurgeon who focused on head and spinal cord injury, I saw this as a platform that could be used to restore function in these devastated patients. At the time, you may remember, most of the work was being done around isolating cells from embryos or collecting cells from the byproducts of an abortion, this fetal material, because the science directed us that stem cells came very early in the development process, and that might be the ideal place to get them. Now, for me as an engineer and as a clinician and as a scientist who was concerned about how we could ultimately create a deliverable for the clinical world, I was troubled by the fact that embryos or fetal material might be a really disadvantageous source material. And I was fortunate enough, and I give my oldest daughter credit, when she was in utero, she taught me an important lesson, because as a young surgeon looking at that first ultrasound, it dawned on me that although she was a peanut-sized embryo, the placenta was already a giant organ. And that it dawned on me that maybe rather than just being a vascular connection between the developing fetus and the mother, maybe this organ played a much more important role as a source of those critical stem cells that were, in essence, creating the fetus and ultimately the newborn. You know, we joke, my colleagues and I joke that the placenta can be thought of as nature's 3D printer that prints the baby. And the way it does that is by generating these remarkable cells that can go in and basically construct the tissues and organs of the newborn baby, and they play a big role, obviously, in fetogenesis and ultimately the creation of that new life. But they also play a critical role in preserving and protecting life throughout the individual's lifetime by being part of that renovation and renewal material that rebuilds our tissues and organs as a consequence of injury or illness, but also just as the process of aging, they're responsible for the continual renovation of our bodies, and that gave me the inspiration to build a business around turning these living cells into medicines.
Well, I'm excited to talk about that. Before we get there, I'm just going to make an assumption that maybe half of our audience has enough science in their background to understand what stem cells are and all of that, and maybe half doesn't. So can you give us a little primer, just a couple of minutes on understanding? You were kind of walking through that, but what things like stem cells are and killer T cells and these important things in the process we're going to be talking about over the next half hour. Just give a quick little cell biology lesson, please, Professor.
Absolutely. So, first of all, we all know every living organism starts out as a single cell. With humans, at the moment of conception, when the egg is fertilized by the sperm, and you get that first cell that defines a human being, that's called a totipotent stem cell. And that totipotent stem cell divides and gives rise to more cells that take on very specialized functions, while in some cases they remain in that stem-like phenotype or form, which gives them the versatility to divide and mature and specialize into all the different cells of the body. So if you think about it, the average adult human is about 25 trillion cells, and those 25 trillion cells are comprised of many specialized forms that give functionality to the organs and tissues that make us a living, functioning organism. So some of those cells go on to become brain cells. Some of those cells go on to become heart cells, etc. Now, what's critical in that process of constructing the very complicated individual with all of these different organs and tissues that perform different functions is that from a single cell that retains this ability to divide and give rise to very specialized cells is the software that gives each stem cell a unique ability to decide its fate based upon a number of different signals. And so from that first cell to the 25 or 30 trillion cells is a series of cell divisions and specializations, which we call differentiation. Mm-hmm. And so what a stem cell really is it's the form of a cell that retains the versatility to become any cell type in the body, and to do so with enough proliferative potential that it can go on populating you for your lifetime. So if we're 25 or 30 trillion cells and these cells are continually being replaced and renewed and renovated, imagine the proliferative fidelity, the incredible precision with which a cell must go from that primordial form to for example, a specialized brain cell, a cholinergic neuron that makes a special type of neurotransmitter that is used in communicating between brain cells to give you the complex processes of brain function. All that originated in a single stem cell. And so stem cells are arguably the fundamental foundation upon which all complicated biology is created and formed. And we figured out ways to collect these cells, store them, and use them for clinical purposes. And it should make sense to everybody. Just like you renovate your house after damage, our bodies must be renovated as well. But instead of using spackle or new drywall to repair a house, we use stem cells to repair our livers, our muscles, our bones, etc. And we're in the business at Celularity of turning those stem cells into the clinical tools to do that.
And as you age, I'm assuming that the number of stem cells drops off precipitously, correct?
Right on, John. That's one of the challenges that we face in our lifetime. Now, stem cells are incredibly proliferative, as I mentioned, but they're not inexhaustible. And there's two things which over time decrease your reservoir of usable stem cells. One is aging uses up some of that population, that reservoir of versatile stem cells. And secondarily, in our lifetime, we're exposing ourselves to all kinds of things which damage the fundamental foundation of a stem cell, which is the biological software that resides in the nucleus of the cell. So it's very interesting. I published a paper with one of my colleagues, Dr. Arnold Kaplan, who unfortunately passed away recently. But Arnie was one of the pioneers in stem cell biology, and Arnie and I used to have this ongoing kind of discussion where I saw stem cells kind of analogous to a master boot disk for your computer. So Craig Venter, the first guy to ever sequence the human genome, and one of my colleagues and partners, Craig very elegantly described that every cell has a copy of your biological software in the nucleus of the cell. And he described DNA, the DNA that's in every chromosome in every one of our cells, as a coding language similar to the coding language that operates your computer. And that means that complicated coding language, and by the way, there's billions of base pairs in every chromosome and in every nucleus of every cell. So if you think about it, the coding language as being comprised of words, there's over 3 billion of these words in every cell that is the formula for how that cell specializes and performs its functions. And so that complicated software has to be preserved in its uncorrupted form for cell number 50 trillion to function normally in your lifetime. And so what I had a realization many years ago was that stem cells, particularly stem cells that can be harvested early in life, hopefully at birth, or at least earlier in life than when you need them, if that uncorrupted software is preserved, it gives you an opportunity to perform all the functions the cell needs to give you a functioning liver, a functioning brain, repair your heart, repair your nerve cells, etc. And so I began to think of it more in terms of, well, stem cells can be thought of as a way of preserving a perfect copy of your biological software and then calling upon that software when needed to replace something that becomes defective in your lifetime. And for example, we know that your biological software in every one of your cells can be damaged by things like viruses, radiation, toxic chemicals, sunlight. And so when that software gets damaged, you either rely on the cell's own repair system to fix it, and those work in some cases, but not in all cases, or you need to replace that cell. And if that cell can be replaced by a perfect copy with a perfectly uncorrupted form of that software, you're going to get the best biologic result.
So what are some examples of current application of stem cell therapy? Then I did have a question. It's a little bit off topic, but about the procedure I had last week. But give me a sense of the actual applications, and then then I can get my fun question answered.
So, cellular medicine has gone through quite an evolution. At the dawn of sort of stem cell, or the realization that stem cells exist and can be recovered and can be stored and used and so on, everybody talked about the concept of regenerative medicine. And regenerative medicine, what that means is it means you use a cellular tool to rebuild and replace damaged or defective cells in your body. And believe me, 30 some odd years ago, that got me really excited. I said, wow. In other words, instead of me using my scalpel and using a pharmaceutical, I can potentially replace and rebuild a damaged organ or tissue just with cells. That got me completely jazzed. And I saw that in order to be able to do this, for this tool to work, I needed to find an abundant, reliable, high-quality supply of these cells that could be used like a therapeutic, like a pharmaceutical. Now, the applications early on were vast. We thought about, I'm going to use stem cells to replace the damaged cartilage in my knee. I'm going to use stem cells to replace the brain cells that get damaged in a stroke. I'm going to use stem cells to fix my heart after an MI. All these things were the targets of developmental efforts and research efforts for decades. What we learned is that these cells do in fact have these functions, but the way to deploy them clinically is more complicated than one originally anticipated. We had to figure out ways to manufacture them to scale and to quality. We had to meet the very high expectations and standards of the regulatory world, the FDA, the regulatory bodies in different countries. We had to figure out ways to dose them. How many do you give? We had to figure out ways, how do you administer them? Do you inject them right into the site you want them to work? Or do you just give them through the bloodstream and they find their way to where they go? So what's happened over the last 3 decades is we've gotten better and better and better at all elements of that, what I think is an engineering challenge, right? It's kind of like systems engineering. I know that cells make up every organ and tissue in the body. I know that during our lifetime, those cells and those cells become damaged and need to be replaced. I need a replacement part. I got to figure out how to make the replacement part. So step number 1 is come up with an industrialized way of taking a starting material in the form of a stem cell and then mass producing it so that it can meet a high quality specification so that when it's released, it can be released to the same expectations and standards of a pharmaceutical. That took a long time to get good at. And I'm very, very happy to say that we focused on that early on because as an engineer, and engineers, we have very, very little personality. We focus on kind of deliverables and high standards and so on. We were able to figure out that if we had the right starting material, we could mass produce those cells, and we can do it in an industrial environment, what we call a culture expansion environment. We could then subject the product to very high release specifications, and we could put it in a format that doctors could deliver it. It's got to be deliverable by injection or by infusion. And so all these efforts took many years to perfect. And I'm very happy to say that now Celularity, like many companies in cellular medicine, are very good at producing cell therapeutics at very, very high quality and very, very tight release specifications. And we're just getting our arms around the best way to deploy it in different diseases. So let me give you an example of one of the early reductions to practice. Okay?
Great.
Turns out that some brilliant work showing that our immune cells can be produced from stem and progenitor cells. And those immune cells can be used to help treat things like cancer, led to the breakthrough that we now know as CAR T therapy. And you mentioned T cells before. CAR T therapy is a fancy way of saying I can engineer a molecule on the surface of a white blood cell called a T lymphocyte. And I can enhance that T lymphocyte's ability to hunt down and kill cancer. Now, we all know that our immune system continually throughout our lifetime is on a surveillance mission, and it's looking for abnormal cells to hunt down and destroy. You've heard this before. We all have some degree of small microscopic abnormalities that lead to cancer developing and emerging and hopefully getting controlled before they become symptomatic and before they become a problem. Our immune system is what protects us from that. And it's through the T cells and the T lymphocytes and the natural killer cells of our immune system that we keep those things under control. However, when they go out of control, if we can figure out what's unique about that cancer, what unique molecular signature on that cancer is what our white blood cells should target, we've gotten good at figuring out how to make your own T cells or donor T cells specifically engineered to hunt down and kill that cancer cell. That technology, CAR T therapy, which stands for chimeric antigen receptor T cells, simply enough, it's creating a guided missile out of your white blood cell. It's saying this is the signature for you to find and kill, and now your T cell, engineered in a laboratory, can go back in, circulate around, find that cancer, and kill it. Breakthrough, a world Nobel laureate quality breakthrough. Now, that's just one of the reductions to practice. There are now my colleagues at a company called Mesoblast have figured out a way to use cells from stem cells to go and control an immune complication of bone marrow transplantation called graft versus host disease.
Mm-hmm.
There are companies that are using stem cells in experimental applications to treat autoimmune disease. We've treated autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease. We've treated degenerative diseases like peripheral artery disease associated diabetic foot ulcers. All of these therapies are either in development, on the threshold of being approved, or in some early iterations, they're actually out there being marketed. But where the future lies, and this is what's really exciting, is cell therapy, I'm absolutely convinced, will be the cornerstone of how we maximize and optimize our health span. And I do believe that the future of longevity is going to be using cell therapies derived from stem cells and derived from immune cells to basically increase our lifespan and help us eliminate or reduce the incidence of these chronic diseases which rob the quality of our lives as we age.
How do we, well, okay, before I have so many questions now, they're like multiplying on my page here the more you talk. But I have to get the answer to this question. So for those of you listening for other reasons, bear with me. So I had this thing last week in my shoulder, PRP and exosomes. So went under, kind of quasi under, took my blood, spin it in a centrifuge, and then re-injected that with exosomes. Now I know that's not stem cells, but I think from the way I understood it is this, I don't want to say a poor man's stem cell, but this is sort of what was available to me to try to repair some damage in my shoulder and my bicep tendon. And so explain to me how this is different, and do I have a shot? Because, I'm a week into this. My shoulder still hurts like crazy.
Well, you hit upon two technologies which are derivatives of stem cell therapy. So you talked about exosomes and you talked about PRP. So let me try and explain that. So PRP, which stands for platelet-rich plasma, is basically a derivative of stem cells that turn into platelets, which are the blood clotting support system of our circulation. And these platelets contain packets of chemicals which are highly pro-regenerative. They can help recruit certain types of inflammatory cells, and they can stimulate regenerative events driven by stem cells in your body. Exosomes are the way those platelet-rich plasma derivatives exert their activity, and stem cells communicate by releasing exosomes. An exosome can be thought of as a little package of chemistry which is produced by cells, which is how cells tell other cells what to do, and it's how cells control their environment in order to maintain a state, what we call homeostasis. And the way it's done is when early in response to an injury, is to recruit the proper kinds of inflammatory cells to clean up debris and kind of do some demolition work. And then following that process, they release factors which stimulate the recruitment of repairing cells. And in your shoulder right now, the first step that's taking place is the PRP is helping in the cleanup process of the damaged tissue, the damaged either tendon tissue or connective tissue. And then it's going to start sending signals to recruit in cells that will participate in the repair process. And like you, I've had exosomes and I've had stem cells and I've had PRP injected in my shoulders for my terrible torn up rotator cuffs and so on. And what happens is that period right now where you're feeling pain, that's the enhanced inflammatory process that those ingredients are sort of driving. What should happen now is within a matter of days is the inflammation starts to decline, and then you get an upregulation or an increase in the chemicals released to recruit the cells that'll do the repair job. And now in your case, all these signals rely on your biology, okay? And so as good as your system is at repairing will be the driving force in and how good a repair you get. The future is going to be where not only do we rely on your cells, but following the PRP and exosomes, which control the inflammation and the post-inflammatory period, we're going to be giving new stem cells, preferably newborn stem cells, which are really good at rebuilding tissue. And that's where companies like Celularity really do their best work, which is providing these brand new spanking baby stem cells, which have all the characteristics of the cells which build your body to begin with. And we like to think of them as participating in the renovation process that you need to fix your shoulder.
And what just blows me away, that was an excellent explanation that I actually now understand much better about what went on, and what I'm going through right now. What seems strange to me is, and I guess because I don't understand enough about the underlying process, but that I can't take any anti-inflammatories or heat or ice or anything. So I'm living on Tylenol, which doesn't really do much. But you said something about my biology, which raises the question with all of these kinds of therapies. Um, are they more effective in younger people than old guys like me? In other words, are these kinds of approaches, do they dwindle in efficacy as a person gets older, or help me under? Because I'm thinking that yes, of course there are applications, and we've seen this with some of the CAR T therapies available now, and you can get like a really cost effective result if you can fix somebody when they're really young. But I'm also thinking about just not just the money, but the biology. Like, hey, John, if you would have done this when you were 30, you would have had a better shot. Am I accurate or am I not accurate?
No, John, you're making a really, really good point. Right now, we're at the stage in cell therapy where the principal ways these things are being done and being provided is in autologous use, meaning you have to use your own cells to try and beef up your response and repair after an injury. Now, your cells still have a lot of muscle in them, and they still have a lot of ability to help address the reconstruction project that exists in your shoulder. But clearly they're not as good as cells that are younger and coming from a much younger environment. That requires us to use what's called allogeneic therapy, meaning we obviously can't use your cells, and we don't unfortunately have some of your cells stored from birth, although there's a lot of people on the planet today who actually have their cells stored since birth. But in your case, what we're working at companies like Celularity is advancing the development of allogeneic therapies so that I can use cells from a newborn to augment your repair process, because I can put them into you. They're tolerated. They don't cause any kind of a negative immunologic reaction, but they can turbocharge, they can supercharge the repair process in your shoulder because they're younger, they're more synthetic, and they're capable of a greater degree of proliferation. And so they're better at fixing the damage than your own cells today. That's where the future is headed. And I'm excited to say that we're getting closer and closer to the regulatory world being so comfortable with the systems and quality of the products that they're going to let us use these allogeneic cells, particularly from newborns, because arguably it's like if you're replacing a part in your car, right? A brand new carburetor is better to replace an old one than and I can't believe I'm saying carburetor. We live in the fuel injection era.
Right.
My God, as a pilot,
I understood what you meant.
but I mean, bottom line is in my airplane, I have two choices when I need to replace a part. I can replace it with a brand spanking new part, or I can replace it with a refurbished part. And let me tell you, I always opt for the brand new part because there's no doubt that you have greater reliability and durability when you use new parts.
I want to kind of turn, because I could talk science forever. This is super interesting to me, but I'm thinking of the business leaders that in healthcare that might be listening to this saying, "Come on, John, let's get on to the money side of things." And so this sort of maybe a three-part question, which is, we know that a lot of, at least what's been approved for these kinds of, we'll call it a bucket of these kinds of therapies, are all very, very expensive, exceeding $1 million, I think. And the last one I saw was 3-something million. Is that a function of, when you have something new, regardless of the product, that it just, there's no room right now for any economies of scale? Is that the issue?
Yeah.
In other words, what can we expect in terms of costs
Yeah.
in some of these treatments?
Listen, the first iteration of any breakthrough therapy is always costly. And it's because that first commercial deployment is attempting to recoup the huge cost of development of these technologies. And so, for example, CAR T therapy, an incredible breakthrough, in its first deployment, was prohibitively expensive. $500,000 to $1 million of treatment is outside of the capabilities of the healthcare system we live in today. Despite the fact that the effectiveness is groundbreaking and clearly warrants the use, the economics of it still haven't reached a point where you're going to see the type of broad dissemination of this technology that would ultimately have a benefit in two ways. More patients would get better, and ultimately the cost would come down because you're spreading the cost of development over a much larger commercial enterprise. All that being said, I can tell you that some of the challenges in cell therapy have related to the industrialization process, being able to mass produce these products to scale, quality, because and I know assembly lines produce products a lot less expensively than cottage industry manufacturers, right? Right now, cell therapy is a cottage industry. We haven't yet introduced all of the technologies to scale and to scale with speed so that you can drive down the cost. I'm very happy to say 2 of the breakthroughs we've made at Celularity have been that our source material, the leftovers of a full-term healthy pregnancy, the placenta, is an incredibly economical raw material source. That's number one. Number two, because of the proliferative power of this organ and the tissues and the cells from the organ, we can mass produce cells at scale that is really kind of unprecedented. That means I can drive down the cost of cell therapies, and I am very optimistic that placental-derived cell therapies, whether they're immune therapies or regenerative therapies, are going to be driven down to the prices of conventional biologic therapies. That's when you begin to really impact healthcare and medicine, particularly if the treatments can change the natural history of diseases. So let me give you one big hope for us. So in our some of our greatest clinical experience is in treating autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease and autoimmune inflammatory bowel disease. We were in our clinical studies, we were able to show a high degree of effectiveness and durability. And I'm happy to say that we were able to drive the cost of producing those experimental products down almost 100x in a matter of years, simply by getting better at the manufacturing process. And I'm very, very confident that those kind of treatments in that setting would not be any more costly than conventional therapy. Most importantly, because of the durability of the responses, I think that the healthcare system would want to adopt it because in the long term, it'll be more cost effective than even the most commonly used biologics or steroid products. And in things like immunotherapy, the same thing applies. Although CAR T therapy in its autologous kind of first application is quite expensive, allogeneic CAR T therapy should also have a big impact on cost reduction. And that'll mean that more patients will get access, and you'll see that it'll have less of a drain on the healthcare system, and it'll ultimately have an opportunity to generate the data so that the healthcare economic community will say this is a preferred modality of treatment because of its effectiveness, safety, and economics.
I was going to say, if I put myself in the shoes of, let's say I'm CFO for Kaiser Permanente, right? That'd be a fun job. I have CEO for Kaiser, or CFO. Excuse
Talk
me,
about
Kaiser.
using Tylenol.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. By the fistful. So if I'm in that role, or even say like a head of pharmacy that's planning out and managing formula, traditional drugs and biologics and things like that, how do I think about in planning and understanding this wave is coming, but so where are we in, if I'm sitting in that health systems leadership role where I've got to be thinking about, okay, these patients are coming into the system, we're treating them, and now we've got this new therapy. How do I think about it? How do I plan for it? Where does it sit in, we just put in a new precision medicine group or unit over here. But how does all of this fit in, and how do I plan for it and what to expect?
It's a really good question. And a lot of us struggle with the fact that when you look at the cost of treating a disease, particularly a chronic disease, it's very difficult to do the real long-term economic analysis without creating a calculus that takes into consideration all of the associated complications of treating a chronic disease, the cost of deploying for what might be considered a high cost therapeutic upfront, and how do you look at the impact it has on the long term cost of care? Let me give you an example. At Celularity, in our regenerative medicine business, not only do we make cell therapies, we also make biomaterial products. These are regenerative therapies produced from the structural components of the placenta that are used to treat chronic wounds, things like diabetic foot ulcers. And so, as an example, I'm a surgeon. I remember the days when diabetic foot ulcers were one of the things I had to treat as a resident. And these are very complicated, difficult things to treat. They are highly erosive. They are complicated by infections. They're complicated by poor circulation. They require continual surgical interventions to debride the wounds, and to in essence continually try and maintain healthy tissue where tissue is not viable to begin with. They usually happen in the setting of very bad peripheral artery disease as a complication of diabetes. The cost of treating these patients over the long term, when you have, in many cases, weekly doctor office visits, weekly treatment sessions, deployment of various products for those wounds, the need for antibiotics, the need for hospitalizations when infections become serious, and then the inevitable amputation surgeries which these things lead to. If you look at the cost of caring for a patient with non-healing diabetic wounds over the lifetime of that patient, I mean, these numbers are quite high. More importantly, the burden on the healthcare system is extensive. Now, if I can administer a product up front, like a placental biomaterial product that helps close that wound faster, the cost of that product, it may be initially thought to be prohibitive, but in the long run may in fact save money, and most importantly, save money in the context of preserving performance and health span in that individual. Now, here's where it gets to be very complicated. Regenerative medicine in its finest iteration is going to be a combination of cell therapy and other regenerative products in order to try and restore the normal function of the tissues that are affected. So I believe that non-healing diabetic foot ulcers will benefit from a combination of cell therapy and biomaterial therapy. And what you'll get is you'll get restoration of normal tissue in this otherwise abnormal setting, and these patients can get back to a quality of life that they had beforehand. And then in the long term, you actually control cost rather than just continue to invest in the same ineffective treatment. And as somebody who's, I mean, listen, we used to with the gallows humor talk about the fact that these patients eventually they require one slice after another as the tissues become more and more damaged and non-viable. There's a cost to every one of those treatments. There's a human cost to the patient for their declining quality of life, and the healthcare system is continually burdened by having to keep these patients in the outpatient and inpatient setting for years at a time. And so, I mean, listen, I dealt with it personally. My mother suffered from a terrible diabetic foot ulcer that was just a chronic problem that not only robbed her of the quality of life at the end of her years, but the cost emotionally, the cost of the healthcare system was very, very difficult to calculate.
So it's a similar argument that somebody who's has a new drug for, let's say, for diabetes, the similar argument that if you can prevent them from getting foot ulcers in the first place, right, and that you can justify a larger sort of upfront expense. But I'm wondering if does that mean that do you think that Medicare, and it's going to sound crazy, but do you think that the federal government, maybe once the costs start coming down, a little bit more and more, that they're going to want to embrace these? Because once someone is on Medicare, 65, once you hit, you have Medicare till you die, at least in this country. Right. That's right.
Right.
But if I'm a 30-year-old working for, some company and I have Blue Cross as my insurance, and, who knows if I'm going to be on Blue Cross 2 or 3 years from now, that's the argument that, payers sometimes will make, maybe not on paper. Maybe they'll say this in closed doors, behind closed doors, right? But hey, we're not spending $1 million on this patient and then have them take another job somewhere else and then have a different insurance company, right? Whereas Medicare, you have more of a captive audience and you could make that value argument over a longer time period. Does that make sense?
It does. And, John, you touched on it a minute ago. You said, maybe I should have addressed this problem when I was 30 instead of now. Okay.
No, I wish.
So let me tell you, I think we have to admit to ourselves, the healthcare system we have in place today doesn't work. Okay. It's way too expensive. The long-term outcomes are not nearly as good as we expected. And it's because medicine is practiced in a reactive manner. Mm-hmm. We begin to implement therapeutic modalities after the problem has already blossomed. Now, you know that in addition to Celularity, I co-founded a number of companies in the precision medicine and sort of preemptive medicine world, Human Longevity and Fountain Life. And those companies are driven to use the tools at our disposal today early enough in life to identify and eradicate causes of premature death and to eradicate causes of chronic illness, which are so stressful on the healthcare system. And most importantly, not only is there an economic argument to use this approach, this preemptive approach, but the argument for quality of life and for the impact on the human capital is I think is undeniable. So I mean, here look at it this way. John, my life started out as an aviator, right? I was a pilot before I was a doctor, and I sometimes call upon my aviation experience in many ways, and it drives a lot of what I do in surgery and in medicine. Aviation went from flying a kite at Kitty Hawk to landing on the moon in 66 years. Okay, imagine that. Okay,
incredible.
the incredible advances made from literally waist height flight to supersonic and extra atmospheric flight in such a short period of time did so because of a tremendous effort to identify every failure through root cause analysis and then take steps to implement an engineered approach to preempt the problems. Airplanes are safe today because every time we've had a mission critical failure, we identified the root cause and developed approaches to identify problems before that root cause can propagate to a critical failure. That's why we have checklists. That's why we have, in the cockpit of my jet, I've got a light, a master caution light, which is yellow, and a master warning light. The master caution light tells me that there's a preemptible problem that could lead to a critical failure if I don't address it. When the master warning light goes off, that's a problem. And that usually is, I'm going to find a place to land. But the master caution tells me that there's something that I can address and preempt the problem from getting any worse. We need to do that in medicine. And the way you do that in medicine is to employ systems that identify problems pre-symptomatic and identify problems at what we call stage 0. Look, the American Cancer Society made it very, very clear. The key to good outcomes in cancer is early detection, right?
Of course.
And if you can detect at stage 0, you can eradicate the disease. Fountain Life was a company that we created to create a systems-wide healthcare network that allowed people proactively to use tools like high-resolution imaging technology, like MRIs, AI-guided CAT scans for cardiovascular disease, molecular analytics like genomic analysis. All of these tools used to identify where the most likely risk exists to create something which will be either impossible to treat or costly to treat. And by the way, the system works, and it works beautifully. So for even applying cell therapy, if you want to get the most out of cellular medicine and regenerative medicine, you want to deploy it early. Right? You want to deploy it before. I want to deploy it before you tear your rotator cuff. When I first see that your degenerative joint disease is going to lead to a mission critical failure in your shoulder, I want to address it with cell therapy and rebuild that shoulder better than it existed before using regenerative tools like cells or exosomes. That's when you get the biggest bang for your buck. And since if you and I both have to go for shoulder replacement surgery, that's incredibly costly. It's a lot more costly than a couple of injections of stem cells, and it's debilitating and is life altering. So we're at a point right now where there's a convergence of precision medicine and preventative medicine and regenerative medicine, and the best way to deploy it is to identify places where it should be used early and prevent the problem from ever advancing to a stage where I have to use those costly and usually minimally effective modalities later on.
So when I was 30 and banging 110 mile an hour serves, which I can't do anymore, even before I hurt my shoulder, that would have been the time. I mean, it also kind of raises the question with athletes, is there sort of preventive, keep your structures in order at the cellular level, right?
Now you're talking my language. Now you're talking about what we now are seeing as longevity, right? And performance medicine. Look, you hit the nail on the head. You wanted to deploy these things at a time in your life where you get to maximize your performance and maintain your high quality health span by preventing any of the degrading changes that occur in your tissues from ever materializing to symptoms. And so you know, and I know the hottest thing in the news today is longevity, right? We've got guys like Brian Johnson who are showing, you know, Brian, who's a friend of mine, Brian is showing you can reverse your biological age, okay? And so we used to think that aging and the decline in our health with aging is inevitable, okay? I'm here to tell you that we now know that you can probably slow, arrest, maybe reverse those changes which we thought were inevitable hallmarks of declining health and performance with age. The best example is in joints. Our joints degrade for lots of reasons. They degrade because of chronic inflammation and chronic injury. That's one thing. We now know that cellular medicine has the potential to help maintain our quality of our health and maintain the performance, our what I call our high performance pillars. So let me tell you, I think you and I may have talked about this. I see that healthy aging is possible if you maintain four things: high performance mobility, which is a combination of keeping your joints in good shape and keeping your muscle tissue in good shape, okay? High performance cognitive function. You got to be able to think and interact with your environment effectively, and cognitive performance is essential. High performance immunity. You want to be able to combat the threats that exist in the environment, whether they're infectious, inflammatory, or whatnot. And then youthful aesthetics. If you can maintain those four things, every year of lifespan you add is worthwhile. Now, the way you do that, if you look at the hallmarks of aging, there are two things that are immediate, in my mind, immediate targets for therapy. The first is, we talked about it already, a declining number of high-performing stem cells in your body, right? Mm-hmm. We use them up. We use them up as we age, and as we age, the stem cells in our body get damaged. So if you have a supply of stem cells that can be used to replace or augment your reservoir of stem cells, that's an obvious avenue to preserve your health. The other thing is that as we age, there's a process that goes on. It's a natural biologic process that goes on called senescence. So you're going to hear more and more in the literature and in the news and so on that senescence is a process by which your cells, as they age, some of them go on to take on a form or a phenotype called a senescent phenotype. What that means is the cell stops dividing, can't divide any longer, and it starts having abnormal synthetic behavior. And it begins to produce something called a senescence-associated secretory phenotype. And what that fancy terminology means is the chemicals the cell produces, instead of being adaptive and useful, they become maladaptive and toxic. And they drive inflammation. And they drive inflammation so bad that there's a term called inflammaging that is associated with age-related inflammation, which these senescence-associated secretory molecules actually drive. The other problem is that they can actually promote the development of cancer. Mm. And so too much inflammation and cancer are the things you want to avoid. Now, how do you avoid it? Well, senescent cells can be cleaned up and eliminated by a process called xenoablation. Now, it turns out that a cell product we make from stem cells and from immune cells we collect from the placenta is called a natural killer cell. We talked about T lymphocytes. Another form of lymphocyte is a specialized lymphocyte called a natural killer cell. And think about it this way. A natural killer cell is pre-programmed to go after the most common threats to survival. Okay? We're born with these cells. These cells are pre-programmed to attack virally infected cells, fungally infected cells, cancer cells, and senescent cells. And what they do is they recognize a molecule on the surface of those cells that's called a stress antigen or a stress ligand. And these natural killer cells hunt and clean up those cells because those are the most common threats to our survival. It turns out that if you have an effective NK system, it continually cleans up the senescent cells, And that does two things. It eliminates the production of those toxic molecules, and it also makes room for repair. Because if I have a senescent cell in the middle of my liver and it's taking up space, I can't replace that with a normal liver cell. So by cleaning them up, cleaning up those senescent cells, I eliminate the toxic molecules that are produced and I make room for regeneration. So that's another critical area in the world of longevity that cell therapy is going to play a role. And at Celularity, the concept of xenoablation was our concept because our placental NK cells not only kill senescent cells, but they eat them up. They chew them up and get rid of them. In my mind, the future of longevity is going to hinge on the deployment of these xenoablative cells in the form of NK cells, and then restoring the health and vitality of your regenerative engine, which are the pluripotent stem cells, which will take up the role of regenerating you after you clean out those senescent cells.
So it's really the way that, and I'm realizing, I thought 5 minutes had passed. Now we're at an hour, so I think we got to wrap it up. But the way that I'm looking at this is that there's really sort of two buckets in my mind. One is all the different therapeutic applications treating cancers and things like that, and then the other is, sort of fountain of youth stuff, right? Longevity, age reversal, and things like that. And I think that probably the latter is not going to impact the health system all that much directly in the short term because people are just going to pay cash for whatever they can to live longer. Am I right about that? And then,
although it's in the best interest of healthcare systems, particularly self-payers, to actually. I mean, let's put it this way: life expectancy today in the United States is in the late high 70s, 76, 78, whatever. The vast majority of the healthcare expenditures occur in the last 5 years of life. That's when all these chronic illnesses begin to really take their toll, and this is where you're concentrating the expenditures. If you added 10 years of healthy life, real health span, and you compacted the 5 years at the end of life, let's say you didn't change how many years at the end you need that expense. If now the 5 years is 5 years out of 90 versus 5 years out of 78, the relative contribution of an individual's economics to their lifespan is much longer, and so the impact of that expenditure is now a much smaller percentage. That has economic benefits, right? That's number one. Number two is I'm convinced these same measures to extend health span and lifespan will actually reduce the cost of caring for those chronic illnesses, which is what robs us of years anyway. And so there is an underlying economic argument that taking steps to extend lifespan, keep people active and healthy in the workforce. By the way, I'm 65 years old. I'm working 7 days a week. I don't for a second think I want to slow down in the next 10 years. And I believe that keeping people healthy, active, and productive in the workforce is maybe one of the only ways we're ever going to deal with the mounting deficit that we're building for ourselves and our kids. And by the way, some statistics that I thought were really eye-opening is if you look at what the most productive period in people's lives, I was shocked to see that the decades between 60 and 80 are the most productive period in a person's lifetime. It's not in your 30s or 40s. And so you have a combination of experience, wisdom, and network at that stage of your life that people can really take advantage of and contribute back to society rather than extract from it.
Well, this is fascinating stuff, Dr. Hariri. I appreciate your taking the time. I'm gonna ask for a future update to come back to this in about a year and see the progress that Celularity has made and some of the just in general in this market. I find it fascinating, and I'm hoping that our listeners will too. So thanks again. Is there a good way, if somebody wants to reach out to you, is there a good way to find you?
Absolutely. They can follow us on our website at Celularity, ULARITY.com is our website. They can also follow Fountain Life. That's Fountain Life, one word, .com. And they can also follow me on my podcast, which is Piloting Health. And Piloting Health is on several platforms, and we talk about a lot of these things. But, John, I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate you inviting me. And, you and I should continue to compare notes on our shoulders.
Yeah, that would be great. But anyway, thanks again. And thanks to everybody for listening to another episode of Healthcare Rounds. Please make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to us, and to follow us as well. And I'm John Marchica, your host, and we'll see you next round. Thanks a lot.